In front of you are 3 paintings. Each work raises questions about Canada, 2 through depictions of land, and 1 through the depiction of important moments in the history of the land that is often referred to as Canada. We will explore the paintings of Tom Thomson, Emily Carr, and Robert Houle, 3 artists who are inspired by place. But today, we look beyond the surface to ask the important question: who's Canada? Close your eyes and think about Canada. What kind of things do you think about? When touring the groups, we get answers like hockey, Tim Hortons, maple syrup, and more. And one thing that is always mentioned is the land. Large forests, open plains, crashing oceans, towering mountains, and a vast Arctic. As Canadians, our identity is often highly connected with the land. Looking at this wall, you will immediately recognize 2 paintings as traditional landscapes. Emily Carr on the left and Tom Thomson on the right are 2 of the most recognized and beloved artists in Canadian art. They are key figures that led to the development of a distinctly Canadian school of landscape painting in the early 20th century. Their work helped to create a body of work that is considered emblematic of Canada by many people. It is likely that many of our visions of the land are derived from these artists and their paintings of that land. Today, though, our key question is whether or not this is an accurate representation. Let's take a closer look. We begin this journey by looking at Tom Thomson's Birch Grove Autumn from 1915 to 1916. Thomson, who was born in 1877, is synonymous with Canadian landscape painting. Though not technically a member of the Group of 7 due to his untimely death in 1917, he arguably was one of the greatest influences in creating what we now consider to be a national identity. His works consist almost entirely of landscapes depicting trees, skies, lakes, and rivers. In May 1912, he visited Algonquin Park for the first time. It was there that he acquired his first sketching equipment and began to paint nature scenes. During his short career, less than 5 years, he produced roughly 400 oil sketches on small wood panels, along with around 50 larger works on canvas. Painted in 1915, this work was created around the midpoint of his painting career. It is the larger studio version worked up from a small oil sketch painted on site. We can see Thomson's characteristic brushwork and bold colors used to capture the unique details of a place he visited. Notice the slightly curved trunks of the birch trees and the particular arrangement of the rocks. But at the same time, we can see his growing sophistication as an artist as he explores a flattening of space and pattern in the way the trees and skies are painted in the top third of the canvas. Next, we move to the far left to look at Emily Carr, who lived from 1871 to 1945. Emily Carr, along with Thomson and the Group of 7, was one of the exceptional and perhaps most original Canadian painters of the first half of the 20th century. Early in her artistic career, she spent time in Europe, primarily in France, where she was exposed to post-impressionism and fauvism. These 2 styles heavily influenced her artistic creation, and she was the first to introduce fauvism to Vancouver. Upon returning home to Vancouver, Carr began a project of documentation, traveling to the islands of the northwest coast, including Haida Gwaii and the Upper Skeena River. At that time, Indigenous culture was thought to be dying and soon to be extinct. This belief was reinforced through colonialist propaganda, and despite Carr's interest in Indigenous culture, she shared the prevailing attitude that this extinction was an inevitable process. Her intention was to make a visual record of totem poles in their village setting before they disappeared forever. To create these images, Carr made sketches and watercolor studies. She worked en plein air, drawing and painting on site, often from the back of a canoe. During this period, her subjects were single totem poles or figures, as well as village scenes. All were infused with the vibrant color, active brushwork, and reduced form of the French school, as can be seen in Yon QCI. In Yon QCI, or Queen Charlotte's Island, we can easily see the influence of post-impressionism on Carr's early work. She uses dabs of bright colors to create a scene of landscape, sky with a coastal village. We know from Carr's writing that her intention was to capture a true representation of the villages that she visited, but as we see in this painting, she does this through a very European lens. Having looked at two paintings that are easily defined as landscape, we can now return to the key questions that began this tour. Whose Canada do we see in these paintings, and is this an accurate portrayal? To answer those questions, we turn to our final painting, Aboriginal Title by Robert Houle from 1989. Robert Houle, born in 1947, grew up in Sandy Bay First Nation, though his time there was cut short due to his forced removal to attend a residential school. Most of his artwork emphasizes how land is the key element in understanding one's history and future path, and is essential in shaping his own Anishinaabe identity. For Houle, the loss of ancestral land has been a cause of a grave identity crisis for generations of First Nations peoples. The legacy of European colonization has rendered First Nations peoples alienated in their own territories, as in Aboriginal Title. Houle's work is meant to function directly within art institutions. Called Aboriginal Title, it subverts and critiques the very institutions in which it hangs, which is a common practice of Houle's as both an artist and a curator. This painting depicts the history that shaped the lands on which we live, and these four crucial dates forever altered both Canadian and Indigenous peoples' relationships with the land and this place. Looking closely at the painting, we ask, why red? What is the importance of the color? What else is red? This forceful piece, with its bright cadmium background, presents four crucial dates in a deep crimson, marking years when legislation was passed that served as legal precedents for First Nations rights and freedoms regarding land. 1763, 1867, 1876, and 1982. For many of you, at least one of these dates may stand out as significant to Canada's history and nationhood. But let's take a very quick look at each one, considering the impact that each date had on Indigenous culture. In 1763, the Royal Proclamation claimed territory in North America with guidelines for European settlement of Indigenous territories. In 1867, Confederation was the first step in defining Canada as a nation by uniting the first four provinces. But support wasn't universal, as Indigenous people were not asked if they wanted to join. 1876 was the Indian Act. It authorized the Canadian government to control the affairs of Indigenous people and reservation communities. It allowed the banning of Indigenous culture and language and opened the door for residential schools. And in 1982, it was the Constitution Act. The Constitution Act enshrined the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution. While Section 35 recognizes and affirms Indigenous rights, early drafts of the Constitution Act did not. Many still feel that this document reinforces colonialism by recognizing Canadian law as supreme, expecting Indigenous cultures to adapt to fit rather than allowing for self-determination. Thinking back to the landscapes depicted by Thomson and Carr, we can agree that they offer a beautiful and important view of landscape painting from the early 20th century. But do you think they offer us a true vision of the Canadian landscape, especially when considering that the landscape is so often tied to the idea of nationhood? When we look at historical works of art, it is always important to consider the time and the place in which they were created, but also to consider the time and place where we now encounter them. Now in the 21st century, the narrative of nationhood presented by Thomson, Carr, and the Group of Seven as a whole propagates a very particular vision of a Canadian landscape that is neither universal or inclusive. This vision depicts Canada's land as barren and available in the case of Thomson's Birch Grove, and presents a vision of the imminent extinction of Indigenous culture in the case of Carr's Yon QCI. Both these landscapes omit or allow for the erasure of Indigenous people and land claim. By linking the land to a sense of nationhood, it is linking the land directly to the country as a whole and its borders, which further reinforces government ownership of the land. At the turn of the century, these ideas were not considered, but now it is essential that we use a consideration of context, authorship, and a new framework of inclusion to truly understand the power of images to communicate ideas. This arrangement of three artistic treasures offers us an important opportunity to explore these ideas, not to devalue important historical works, but to use our perspective to appreciate the potential to see a way forward.